We've been spending some time in ancient Sumer, right? All those city-states and ziggurats and complex social structures. We've talked about their gods and goddesses.
And how their religion wasn't just some abstract set of beliefs. It was a force that shaped their world. I mean, especially their leaders.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us to today's deep dive. Sumerian kings' power and politics. Not just rulers, divine kings, chosen by the gods themselves. Talk about power, huh?
It was about a whole worldview, one where the king was the link between the divine and us humans. Divine kingship, it wasn't just about one person grabbing power. It was a system rooted in their whole cosmos.
I'm trying to picture like a king with a glowing halo over his head or something. Was it really that straightforward?
Oh, if only. It probably evolved over time,
Oh.
intertwined with their myths, their understanding of the universe. But the basic idea was that kings were chosen by the gods. They had this authority to rule, to make sure their people were okay.
So like a divine mandate kind of thing?
Right. Not like a literal contract or anything, but this deep belief that the gods themselves had picked this guy, giving him the right to rule, but also this huge responsibility to protect everyone.
Okay, so it wasn't just about grabbing power. It came with expectations. How did they convince everyone they were chosen by the gods, though? Just fancy ceremonies and outfits.
Well, visuals were a big part of it. Think super elaborate ceremonies, special clothes, symbols that made the king stand out. But they also had these titles, right? Titles that were meant to reinforce their connection to the gods and to the people. Like they were often called the shepherd of the people.
Stuff to the people. I like that. It's not just ruling, it's guidance, protection.
No.
But were all Sumerian kings seen as equally divine? Were there any standouts?
Oh, absolutely. Some left a bigger mark than others, for sure. I mean, we're talking about figures like Sargon of Akkad, Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
or Nomu, names that echo through history.
Okay, now those are some names I recognize, especially Gilgamesh. He's got that whole epic poem, right? I always get him mixed up with a superhero or something. Was he a real king or just a legend?
That's the fun part of ancient history, untangling fact from fiction. The Epic of Gilgamesh has all those wild elements, sure, but most scholars think he was a real king of Uruk, maybe around 2700 BC.
Wow, so maybe there's a real person behind all those adventures. What kind of king was he, based on the epic?
Well, the epic paints him as powerful, but also flawed. Arrogant at first, but through all his crazy adventures, he learns these huge lessons about humility, friendship, what life really means. A king who starts as a tyrant but learns and grows.
That's really interesting. It seems like even back then, they weren't afraid to tell complex stories about their kings.
Exactly. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a window into what they valued in kingship. The power, the responsibility, ambition versus divine will. That's a story that still works today.
Totally. It makes you wonder what people back then expected from their leaders. Okay, so Gilgamesh, the legendary hero king. What about Sargon of Akkad? What's his deal?
Sargon, he was a game changer. Imagine all these Sumerian city-states always fighting, alliances changing constantly. Then Sargon comes along, right? Military strategy, willpower,
Yeah.
unites them all under his rule, created one of the world's first empires, the Akkadian Empire.
It's huge. From battling city-states to an empire, just like that. So he was a military genius.
He was, for sure. The Akkadians, they were known for military innovations. Like they used chariots, but not just as fancy rides. Speed, maneuverability, flanking maneuvers, and advanced siege techniques. They had these battering rams, just pulverized city walls.
I bet those are terrifying to see coming at you. But it wasn't all about brute force.
Right. Sargon, he was also a strategist, a diplomat. He made alliances, consolidated power through marriages, smart politics. He understood power on all these different levels.
So military might A&D political smarts. I bet his empire changed Mesopotamia completely.
Oh, absolutely. His rise, it was a turning point, a new era, an era of empires.
Makes me think about the king as shepherd of the people, right? What do we know about Sargon's rule and how it affected the average Sumerian? Huge changes.
That's a tough one. We know Sargon's conquests changed the map, the politics. But how much daily life changed? We're still figuring that out.
Still so much to learn about Sargon and his legacy. Okay, we've got Gilgamesh, the hero king, Sargon, the empire builder. What about Ur-Nammu? What's his claim to fame?
Ur-Nammu. He's known for something revolutionary. A law code, one of the very first from any civilization. We're talking centuries before Hammurabi. By writing down laws, he brought a new level of order, of justice to Sumerian society.
Hold on, a written law code? That's insanely advanced for the time. What kind of laws? Like eye for an eye stuff? Brutal punishments?
There are harsh punishments, yeah. But it's so much more than that. It's actually sophisticated. Property rights, inheritance, family law, even trade regulations. Or Namu's code. It's not just about punishment. It's a society trying to figure out fairness, order, a precedent for legal systems all over the world for centuries.
That's mind-blowing. They really want it to be fair, to have clear expectations, and it tells us so much about their values, their social structure. It's like a guide to their whole society. Like they emphasize protecting widows and orphans. That says a lot about their sense of responsibility, right?
Exactly. A testament to their intelligence, how they built these systems.
Okay, so we've got these amazing kings, each leaving their mark. Gilgamesh, Sargon, Namu. Sumerian history was never boring. But I have to ask,
What's on your mind?
we keep talking about kings and power, but what about the priests? Weren't they super powerful too?
You're so right. We can't forget them. They were at the heart of Sumerian politics society. The thing is, the relationship between kings and priests, it was complicated. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes they competed. You got to imagine the tension. They were both vying for influence, for resources. And it makes you think, if kings were supposedly divine, why did they need priests at all? Couldn't they just talk to the gods directly?
Yeah, that seemed like there'd be some tension built in, right?
Absolutely. And there were definitely conflicts. We have records of kings and priests fighting openly. In Lagash, for example, the kings and the priests of Akkad and Girsu, they had this rivalry.
Yeah.
And it escalated into a full-blown war. That shows you how high the stakes were.
Wow, a war between a king and the priests. Intense. Are there other examples of how this played out in different cities?
Oh yeah, lots. Like in Uruk, the temple dedicated to Inanna, it was huge, controlled tons of land and resources. It wasn't just a religious center, it was an economic powerhouse.
So the priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were economic players. Must have been a headache for the kings.
It was. Kings had to be careful. Sometimes they cooperated, supported each other's authority. But sometimes their interests clashed. Power struggles were inevitable.
Sounds like managing the priests was just as important as winning battles, making laws, all part of the power game in Sumer.
Exactly. In a society where religion was everywhere, a king couldn't succeed without understanding the priests managing their power.
This is so fascinating. There's always more to discover about ancient Sumer.
Definitely. And as we keep digging into these kings, we'll find even more incredible stories, ambition, and how their legacy lived on. It really shows how religion and politics, they were all tangled up together in Sumer.
Totally. Like trying to separate threads in a tapestry or something. Speaking of which, those ziggurats we talked about before.
Incredible, right? The ziggurats.
Yeah.
Not just amazing architecture, but centers of power, religious and economic. Remember, those temples, they controlled so much, and the priests running them, they had real influence.
Right. It makes you wonder, how did these god kings, with their whole divine mandate thing, how'd they see those massive temples? Rivals, allies, something else?
That's what's so interesting. It wasn't a fixed relationship, kings and temples. It depended on personalities, politics, even which god the temple was for.
Ooh, I bet there are some crazy stories there. Any examples come to mind?
Well, take one of the biggest Sumerian city-states. They had this huge ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It was like a symbol of their power, how well they were doing.
I can picture it, this massive ziggurat glowing in the moonlight, priests doing their rituals. Must have been impressive.
For sure. And the kings of they got it. They knew how important the temple was, so they acted like these super devout patrons, paid for the upkeep, took part in the ceremonies.
Smart move. Like saying, hey everyone, look at me, I'm best friends with the gods.
Exactly. It made their rule seem more legit, and it kept the priests and the people happy. But that doesn't mean everything was perfect. Sometimes kings tried to get more control over the temple's money, who got appointed as priests. Caused friction.
Ah, so it wasn't all happy times.
Power dynamics are never that simple. We have records of kings trying to limit the temples, their economic clout, even challenging certain priests. It was this balancing act, a constant negotiation.
Politics, even way back then, complicated stuff. But in the end, kings and priests, they needed each other, right?
That's the key takeaway. Kings needed the priests to say their rule was legit, to keep society running smoothly with all the rituals and beliefs, and the priests needed the king's protection, money, to do their thing, to stay important.
So a two-way street, but a bumpy one. We've talked a lot about the kings, but I'm curious about the regular Sumerians. Did any of this, Sargon's empire, Namu's laws, did it change their lives?
Historians are still working on that. We know these events were huge politically, but how much did daily life change for people? It's a debate.
So there's still a lot we don't know about how these big power shifts affected individuals, like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Right. And it reminds us that history isn't just about the big names, the big events. It's about the everyday people, how they lived through these changes.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture. Actually, going back to the priests for a second, we've talked about their power, their relationship with the kings. But what did they do all day?
It depended, what their rank was, which god they served. Some were high up, advising kings, managing temple states. Others did the rituals, interpreted omens, taught in temple schools, and some did practical stuff, keeping the buildings up, making beer, managing the temple farms.
Busy folks. Sounds like they were involved in everything.
Totally. Not just religious figures, but teachers, administrators, economic leaders. Their influence reached way beyond the temple walls.
This makes me think, we've talked about how kings kept their power, but what about the priests? How'd they stay influential?
Yeah. Their power came from their link to the divine, mainly. They were the bridge between the gods and everyone else, right? They did the rituals, the sacrifices to keep the gods happy. That gave them huge influence. People relied on them for, well, everything, for their safety, their good fortune.
So knowing the divine, being able to talk to the gods, that's what made them powerful.
Yep. And don't forget, they controlled the temples. Those weren't just religious buildings, they were economic and political hubs. Tons of land, workers, resources. That gave the priests leverage when dealing with kings. They could sway political decisions.
Sounds like they had some serious power. Did they ever use it to go up against the kings?
Oh, yeah, we have records of that. Priests using their religious authority to oppose a king or to change policy. Like they could say bad omens were happening, refuse to do certain rituals, even turn public opinion against the king they didn't like if they thought he was being unfair or not pious enough.
So they weren't afraid to stand up to the kings, huh? Makes you realize Sumerian power wasn't just the king at the top, it was more balanced.
Exactly. Kings and priests, it was complicated, always changing. Kings had power, sure, but they couldn't rule without the priests, without their cooperation. It was this dance, power, negotiation, compromise, all the time.
It's amazing how these different groups, how they all worked within this power structure. It shows that even in societies with one big figurehead, there's always more going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And to understand Sumer, you have to understand these power dynamics. It's all part of the bigger picture.
So big picture, what can we learn from these Sumerian kings and how they ruled? What's their legacy?
Sumerian kingship, it had this huge impact on Mesopotamia and even beyond. They created a lot of the political and religious systems that shaped the region for centuries.
That's a big deal, like specific laws, customs, or even ways of thinking about leadership.
All of it. The idea of divine kingship, that started in Sumer. Spread throughout Mesopotamia, influenced empires like Babylonia, Assyria.
Wow, so this idea of god kings, it had a ripple effect across time, across cultures.
For sure. And then the law codes like Ur-Nammu's. That set the stage for writing down laws, creating justice systems.
It's amazing how those early kings, they set things in motion that we still have today. Imagine a world with no written laws. Yikes.
Right. Their innovations in how they governed, how they administered things, even military tech. It all had this lasting impact.
It's mind-blowing. These ancient civilizations, with so little, they achieved so much.
It shows how ingenious they were, how resilient, how they were always trying to create order, find meaning in a world that was full of challenges.
We've been on quite a journey, haven't we? Sumerian kingship, divine mandates, power struggles, temples, legacies. What stands out to you? What surprised you? Anything you want to know more about?
I always think about how human these ancient kings were. They were divine, sure, but they had problems, they made mistakes, they wanted to leave their mark, just like us.
Totally. It's like looking through a time machine and seeing ourselves, our hopes, our ambitions, our struggles. It's that human side that makes history so interesting, you know? They weren't just names in a book, they were real people. Their own stories, what drove them, what they hoped for.
Right. And when we learn about them, their choices, we understand the past better, but also ourselves, I think.
I agree. One last thing before we wrap up this deep dive. It's been bugging me.
Okay, what is it?
We've talked about these god kings, their power, all that. But the everyday Sumerians, what did they think about it all? Did they see their rulers as good guys? Scary tyrants? Something in between?
Ooh, good question. Historians have been debating that forever. Seems like it was complicated how people felt about their kings.
Complicated is good. Tell me more.
Well, on one hand, kings were seen as, like, chosen by the gods, right? They were supposed to keep things running, make sure things were fair, protect everyone, like we talked about, shepherd of the people, that kind of thing.
Right, that suggests they cared about everyone, not just themselves.
Exactly. And kings often did stuff for the whole community. Irrigation systems, temples, city walls.
So they weren't just living it up in their palaces while everyone else worked their butts off.
Not always, no. They had a good life, sure, but their job was also to serve the gods and the people.
Interesting how this idea of leadership being about service, it goes back that far.
It's a basic human thing, I think.
Mm.
We need leaders who think about the good of everyone.
Okay, so there was respect for the king as protector, provider, but was it always like that? Were there times when they abused their power?
Of course, power can corrupt anyone, even if you think you're chosen by the gods. There are stories of kings who were greedy, taxed people too much, started wars that didn't need to happen, ruled like dictators, made people unhappy.
So not a perfect system.
No system is. Sumerian kings, like any leader, throughout history, they had good sides and bad sides. What their people thought about them probably depended on a lot of things, their own lives, what was going on at the time.
Makes you wonder, what was it really like back then? Those everyday people, farmers, craftspeople, what did they think about their god kings?
We can only guess, really, use the clues they left behind.
Yeah.
But that's part of what makes history so cool, right? This is mysteries, getting glimpses of human experience from so long ago.
Well said. Well, our time's just about up. We've done a deep dive into Sumerian kingship, divine power, struggles, temples, legacies. What stands out to you the most?
I'm always amazed at how Sumerian civilization, it influenced so much that came after. The idea of god kings, written laws, how they organized societies, like they planted these seeds that grew into so much what we know today.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing how influential they were. Okay, deep divers, last thought before we go. Imagine you could travel back in time to ancient Sumer. You're standing before one of these powerful kings. What would you ask him? About his life, what he believed, what he hoped for, what scared him. What could we learn from someone who lived so differently from us?
That's a great way to end it. It makes us think about things from a whole different perspective. Step into someone else's shoes, someone who lived thousands of years ago.
And maybe by thinking about their experiences, we learn something about ourselves, too. About our own lives, the world we live in.
The echoes of Sumer are still here, you know? Reminds us how creative humans are, how we're always searching for meaning that never goes away.
On that note, we'll say goodbye for now. Deep divers, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep diving deep into history. See you next time.